Okay, I'll turn to the audience first. Did anyone have a question? Okay, let's start off with one of the sisters. I'll go to you. Yeah, you can ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum. My name's Sana. My question's addressed towards Dr. Samir Mahmoud. It's a bit of a long one, but I'll just read it out. You mentioned that we have a fitra, a self that we must actualize to achieve our full potential, and that in order to go through this process of self-actualization and internal jihad, we must embrace the broad spectrum of Islamic tradition. I would like to ask, how can one enlighten and elevate their self in isolation in their day-to-day life? Are the traditional methods of tasawwuf enough and still applicable? And is just ibadat enough to purify one's soul and to transition from nafs lawama to nafs mutmainna? Thank you.
I think Shaykh Haisam probably is best placed to respond to that question. Tafadhal, Bismillah, Bismillah. Bismillah. Okay, I'll just give a brief interjection and then hand that over to Shaykh Haisam. From what I've learned from many of the ulama myself, we live in difficult times, and so the process of tazkiyah is one that presents itself with some challenges, especially when what is required is sometimes a degree of introspection that is beyond the capacity sometimes of a lot of us, simply because we're not reared or raised in this particular way. But as many of the ulama also point out again and again, your adherence to the deen, in terms of your ibadah, in terms of your soul, in terms of your prayer, in terms of the shara, that is tazkiyah in of itself. That's ihsan, right? So I think a lot of people make the confusion that what do I have to do to get a shaykh and follow the tariqah in order to arrive at the haqiqah, and I bypass the whole question of the sharia. How to get there is not your worry. Your concern and your main worry is doing what you need to do at this particular moment with the purity of heart, purity of intention, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would unfold the path and the people you need as you advance along the way. Along the way. Bismillah, Shaykh Haisam.
I agree 100%, mashallah alaikum.
Okay, I got a text, so I'll do a text and then a question from the audience. This one's to Shaykh Haisam, but both of you can answer if you want. What are your thoughts on Andrew Tate and the whole red pill conversation? In my opinion, it seems as though red pill Islam is one of the few conversion moments that gets a ton of converts. So should we be on board with it? If so, how do we moderate its excess?
Sure, it's a great question. I'll do it as quickly as I can. And that's a result of feminism. And us as Muslims, we don't have... I'm going that way, so all the sisters just go this way. But we don't have feminism. We don't need feminism. It's all in the Quran. It's all in the prophetic tradition. Allah is not going to do dhulm to sisters, to females. Doesn't happen for us. We don't have that. It's not a question. Are there some things in the Sharia that aren't being brought to the fore that are specific about women? Yes, but that's a question of practice. The jurisprudence is hundreds of millions of scholars have gone through it throughout time. Who needed feminism? Is the West. Europe. Women, the debate was, do they even have souls? That was the debate. And then it wasn't until 1890 or 1888, or 1889, I can't remember the exact year, where women were allowed to own property, where they were allowed to inherit. They needed feminism. And so what happened was it skewed the other way, skewed all the way unfortunately against men. And then the family violence that happened, which was bad. It happens in all societies, happens in all cultures. We've got things to deal with that. It was, remember I think it was Sean Connery, give her a slap or whatever it was, and every once in a while. They had that. We don't have that. It's haram. You can't go around hitting people, let alone your wife. It's not allowed to do that stuff. So it just swung the pendulum all the way over, whichever way you want to say, one way or the other. And that conversation, and it became that happy wife, happy life. What about happy husband? It's a partnership. It's not even a partnership. Allah said, azwaja. Zawj is a pair. Zawj is a pair. It's like you lose one shoe, you're not going to keep the other one. You have two shoes. They come together. We come together. We are together. We are one together. خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن نَفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ. From one, we don't have that issue. So, look, he's got his issues, Mr. Tate. Alhamdulillah, he became a Muslim. But, some of the guys and some of the Muslim guys commentating on it as well, talking about, if I work, I shouldn't have to clean. Habibi, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he cleaned. Don't take it too far as well. All right? Came feminism one way too far. Don't take it too far the other way. I got money so I can have illicit relation. What? Where's that in Islam? No, it's not the case. But what it's done to some extent, very quickly, like I said, it just touching on the, it's just kind of giving people, put things back towards somewhere that's closer to equity, one might say.
Did anyone in the audience have a question? I'll go to the brother side. The microphone runner can pick.
Assalamu alaikum. I had a question for Shaykh Haisam on the right. How should we approach Muslims at university who think they have a sort of superiority over less practicing people or non-Muslims?
So, sorry, who has a superiority?
Who think they have some sort of superiority in terms of how they practice the religion?
Yeah, it's difficult to approach people because takabbur, that's the Arabic word for it, is a person who they put themselves on a pedestal. So it's a sense of entitlement. The best way is probably to talk about the stories of the righteous, not directly to that individual, particularly if that person's in authority or carries some sort of respect, garners respect from a decent amount of people. The best thing is to remind, not directly, but talk about stories of the righteous and the levels they were at and the humility, like Sayyidina Umar, Allah Mardanhu, one of the governors came from Syria, and he said, do you want to eat with the Khalifa, Amir al-Mu'mineen, or do you want to eat with the poor Muslims? He said, no, I'll eat with the Khalifa. And so Sayyidina Umar just had this dry bread. It was so dry, the guest, he could hardly eat it. The next day, Sayyidina Umar, Allah Mardanhu, asked him, he said, no, I'll eat with the poor Muslims, and they were eating wheat bread and different types of things. So stories like that allow the nur of Allah, because me and you can't do anything. The Prophet couldn't do anything, alayhi salatu wasalam, for his uncle Abu Talib. He said, إِنَّكَ لَمْ تَهْدِ مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ يَهْدِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. You can't guide who you will, but Allah guides whoever He wills. You can't guide who you love. Allah will guide who He wills and who He wants. So that doesn't mean we don't call people. And the other way is, which I didn't mention, I should have, in the bina of that, is the actual dua. Like, we have to cry. We really have to realize the Prophet ﷺ, as the hadith goes, that when the janazah of a Yahudi, when the funeral procession of a Jewish person came past, the Prophet cried. He cried. Tafallata minni. He got away. He's gone for hellfire when a'udhu billah. So if we don't have that level of shafaqah, whether they're up or down or whatever it is, we're not crying at night, we're not serious about getting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy to descend, it's not going to happen.
I got another text. This is for Dr. Samir. I wanted to ask how specifically ADHD as a mental health disorder aligned with the views spoken about during the first talk.
Okay, I think it's not necessarily the right place to discuss that, but some of the issues related to those you find in some classical manuals. So I mentioned that we have to go back to the classical manuals and the classical models of understanding the self in the classical Islamic tradition. Some issues were addressed, like depression. I mentioned depression, compulsions, for example, waswas al-qahri. These were terms that are actually coined by 9th century Muslim figures. They weren't coined 19th or 20th century. They were coined about over 1,200 years ago. But some issues, like the attention deficit disorder and some of these other related things, I think, to my knowledge, 20th century phenomena that relate to particular ways in which you raise children. The Islamic tradition doesn't have any particular say or statement on some of these issues, because as we mentioned earlier, the model of the self in the classical Islamic tradition is the ruh, there's a nafs, and there's a body, right? There's a spirit, there's a soul, and there's a body, a jism. And within the problems that sometimes arise between the relationship between the body and the nafs, the psychosomatic issues and problems that arise, they arise more on a horizontal level in regards to the development of the individual from birth to adulthood. And so these don't necessarily directly pertain to anything related to spiritual issues or the spiritual journey towards God, but they have to do with particular psychological problems that have to do with that particular individual or environmental conditions. And there's a lot in the literature on these particular questions in the Islamic tradition. A lot of what contemporary psychology has to say about these is absolutely fine. The model and paradigm they're rooted in is problematic. So that's why I said it's without getting into a critique of contemporary psychological models, it's going to be difficult to really express that clearly. So I'll give you an example. In many of the classical manuals, they make a very clear distinction between bodily causes for some problems, psychological causes for some problems, soul-related causes for some problems, and other causes. Those that pertain to the body or the psyche, the psychosomatic, these are purely observable through empirical observation. So a lot of contemporary psychology has a lot to say on that issue. So for example, any manual on these issues in contemporary psychology may address these sufficiently. Where the problem is where it begins to address matters of the soul, the nature of the soul, and other issues related to it becomes problematic. I hope that kind of clarifies to a certain extent some of the issues and problems. The depression we talked about earlier, or narcissism, nihilism, some of these issues, these pertain to very deep-rooted existential problems left behind through the absence of God. That void and abyss we talked about earlier results in these fundamental, time-defining or epoch-defining psychological problems. We can call them meta-problems, narcissism, nihilism, and some of these other issues, which then generate all sorts of other psychological problems. Okay, enough on that.
Did anyone in the audience have a question? I'll go to a sister.
My question's for Shaykh Haisam. So you mentioned that there is the difference between dawah that is of Islam and dawah of Muslims. And from your talk, I understood that because we're a rudimentary society at the moment, our dawah is primarily going to be dawah towards Muslims. So what would dawah of Islam look like when we do become a more established society?
Great question, mashallah. Maybe I didn't make it as clear as I thought that I had. It's the intention. It's the intention. So when Muslims migrate, and it's halal to migrate to live in a safe society, it's halal to migrate to chase trade and chase money and all these types of things, it's completely halal. But when Muslims migrate for those purposes, then Islam doesn't get established. It's when they migrate for the purposes of establishing Islam with the intention. So that's, excuse me, that I didn't clarify that as much. For us to do what you said, like how does a company run? How does a charity run? How does any organization run? They have a vision statement, they have policies, they have procedures, and it would be no different. If you look at just about every other religious organization, the majority of religious organizations in Australia are statutorily protected anyway. There's statutory bodies, Catholic Church and all the rest of them. They tried that with us. We can't get it together. We're just in the too hard basket. It's like, we can't. It's like weighing frogs, dealing with Muslims. So, and there's a thing that throughout history of Muslims, it's like a body called Ahlul Ra'i, the people who have good opinion. So it includes scholars, it includes intellectuals, it includes people of business and academics, and all the people that a good cross-section of society, that they come up with what do the Muslims need. And even the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Allah marda anhu, the Prophet of Allah, of course everyone knew it was going to be Sayyidina Abu Bakr, but the big heads of the families and the respected people in Medina, they said, look, we want you. And they made it official in that way. And that's how it continues. And so we don't have these kind of bodies. We have pseudo-political uncle, with all due respect, I'm pretty much an uncle these days, uncle bodies, that exclude women and that just don't include the youth, and they don't really know what's going on. Allahu Alam if they even care about what's going on with the Muslims. They got their own agendas and things like that. So that would be one thing that that we'd need to have. And like I said, if we don't connect to the black fellas, we don't connect to their mobs, we're joking. It's a joke. Sorry, I know, like I said, I'm good at disparaging, so forgive me. But what? I mean, they haven't. If you look at because I'm a lawyer, if you look at the Mabo decision, and you should all read it actually. It's pretty long, and some people might say it's a bit verbose. But with the referendum coming up, everyone should know about that. They never seceded. The High Court of Australia said that the way that the English came, even by they're called Blackstone's laws, is wrong. There is no terra nullius. That doctrine is gone. There's two other ways to take over a country. One is by declaring war and invading, which they didn't do. The other one is by treaty. That's the New Zealand version, the treaty they've got there. They didn't do any of those things. So this is a country where the biggest wrong, whatever's going on with Muslims, yeah, that's one thing. Even when you look at there's a lot of studies, the doctor would know, and on the lowest, the people that are trusted the most and disliked are the black fellas. They like to be called black fellas, apparently, so that's why I call them that. The Aboriginal people. No one likes them. Nobody trusts them in this country because they've been demonized. So if we as Muslims, if we don't reach out, if we don't have a connection with them, then the barake won't be there. The blessing won't be there because it's their land. Like whatever we want to think, whatever Tony says or whatever Fulan says, he doesn't know. He's an elected official. The High Court's made a ruling on what the law was. It was an invasion. There's no doubt about it. An illegal invasion. Illegal. There's no legalities. They don't even follow their own laws. So, and then we can't forget about the white fellas as well. Yeah, because what they did in this country, they did, right? But we are benefiting from it as well. Sayyidina Musa, where did he grow up? Yeah, in the house of Barakallah, in the house of Fir'aun, the biggest taghut, the biggest zalim ever. And what did Allah Azza wa Jalla say to him and Sayyidina Harun when he sent them back, alayhi salam, say, Qula lahu qawlan layyina. Say something gentle. Yeah, they did the oppression, but say something gentle. Can't just go off and, say something, but I'm not going to. You can't just go off that way. You've got to approach things in the right way with the right respect. And so if we want Islam to be established, we have to establish Islam. Where's our Islam? We got halal, right? Hajj would know. We got halal. What part of halal do we own? Who can tell me what part of halal we own? We do two things. Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, and now they've got machines that don't need us. And we fax out, there used to be faxes. Does anyone know what a fax is? Right? There used to be, people aren't laughing. This is an old machine that was before email. They used to fax out, we rang them, they used to fax out the halal certificates. How many, who knows how much the halal business industry is worth in Australia? Yeah, 22, at last count, $23 billion. $23 billion. Basically all of country Australia, which is the vast majority of Australia. Sorry, Doctor. It runs on halal. We can't even do that for ourselves. Where's our halal banking? Where is it? That thing they call whatever. I mean, good luck to you. But where's our halal insurance? In Malaysia, after you pay your premiums for 3 years, on the 4th year you make a return on investment and you've got insurance. Where is it? Imagine if we had an ad on TV. Have you seen the bank ads? Goodness, they make themselves look like they're angels. They're worse than the Merchant of the Shylock in the Merchant of Venice. Yeah, where's our ads? Come, insure with us, and we'll give you after 3 years. What? You tell me that's not going to bring people to what? Islam. Because there's a madhar. There's something called Islam, not Muslim.
I had a few questions on this topic coming through, so this is actually for Shaykh Haisam again. Would you be able to elaborate on your thoughts on Holden Street? I think it's clear there are practices and fitna present, so one person going there would be affected internally, but alienating and haram policing them also isn't the answer. So what should our stance be and practical steps to utilize Holden Street in the best way possible?
MashaAllah, great question. As I said, go in groups. So have, speaking to different people. Depends on what your intention is, what you want to do there. Hand out pamphlets, as someone was saying, or CDs, whatever it is these days that you can get to people, giving something away for free. I'm not 100% sure. But if you want to be a da'i, if you want to do da'wah, you've got to go into environments that are un-Islamic. That's the whole point of da'wah. Da'wah is not to Muslims. That's tadhkir al-mudhakara. That's just reminding. To Muslims, it's not da'wah. It's da'wah is to inviting to people who haven't accepted La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. That's what that is. So you've got to be ready. And if you can't handle it, simple, don't go. If you can handle it for half an hour, go for half an hour. If you can be there every day, give da'wah, and that increases your iman. That increases your iman. We used to ask these questions to our mashaykh, like, Shaykh, what's going on? We're not. You guys are amongst awliya and salihin and these righteous people and the friends of Allah. We're the guys we work with and our schoolmates. They take drugs and they're alcoholics, and when older they have sex, they don't even have showers afterwards. And the Shaykh started crying. I was like, oh, sweet, I felt good about myself. I'm going to get a pass here. I'm going to get a pass. And the Shaykh goes, you're the field for you to do da'wah. How many people, you asked me, become Muslim with you? I said, a few people. He said, that's never happened to me. Everywhere you go, by you sticking firm to your faith, in the face of what's going on, your iman increases.
Did anyone in the audience have a question? Oh, Imran. Okay.
I think you chose me. Assalamu alaikum. I have a question for both people on the panel. If I was to start with Brother Haisam, I wanted to start with an observation actually before I ask the question. One thing, as a very active Muslim who's been very involved in the Muslim community, I've noticed that a lot of Muslim people, they try to take on dawah, and they come with this focus of trying to make Australia Muslim, trying to convert the non-Muslims to Islam. However, when it comes to our own community, unfortunately, we have a superiority complex. We tend to think we're better. We tend to exclude people that are less practicing as Muslims. And I feel like somewhere they slip through the cracks, because if I give an example, if a Muslim person whose iman was lower turned up to the mosque and he was drunk, I think the first reaction most of us would have is, what is he doing here? Why is he in the mosque? Instead of actually working with that person to become closer to Islam, and that is actually very important dawah as well, that we often neglect. Too many youngsters, I feel, come with this attitude of making every non-Muslim Muslim, so that numerically we actually have more of a Muslim population. But what I feel is that leaves a void in the Muslim community as well, in the Ummah. A lot of Muslims themselves don't feel connected to their faith. A lot of Muslims, especially students, for lack of better words, feel turned off when they see religious people preaching Islam. And I feel like what that has done, it's created a void, it's created a bit of an emptiness. Would it be worth revisiting our focus when it comes to dawah, so that we are stronger as an ummah, we are more connected together, and then that shines outwards towards the non-Muslim community and inspires them. And my question for Brother Samir is, I wrote it down because I had a lot of thoughts. With the rise of contemporary issues in society comes a rise in the need for direction and Islamic psychology, especially amongst Muslims. If we see Islamic psychology as a field or discipline, is there a game plan to bring that out so that it's more available to Muslims and maybe even non-Muslims? When I think about therapy, when I think about massages, I think about Chinese therapy, medicinal therapy. You think about barbecue, you think about Korean barbecue. Is there anything that, because I can see Islamic psychology having that breakthrough in society where even non-Muslims feel attracted to it. And in that, they can find Islam. Who knows? That could be dawah as well. But is there a game plan? Because there's so much of a rise in contemporary challenges that we face. Is there a game plan to tackle that? And is that something that's on the agenda as well?
Inshallah, I'll be quick. So some of the things I mentioned, of course, what you're saying, that's a part of it. Today we were just talking about dawah, which is the definition of which is to talk to non-Muslims and invite non-Muslims. So part of that that we spoke about was the individual, the that building the individual, and that means that person's got to be educated about their deen. They've got to have a spiritual path, those types of things. Hopefully, someone that can lead them on that path. So that's a part of that. And if we have the overreaching or the overarching intention of da'wah, that, in other words, when we rear our children, we don't say, my darling, be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, which that's what our parents told us. We say, first and foremost, be a da'i. If we teach them that, then and not just a calling, all the things that we mentioned to build their Islamic knowledge, their suluk, in other words, their path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and their spirituality, and their akhlaq, and their disposition, all those things. So that would take care of that. We're not at that stage, so we have to do what you're saying. We have to regress in a sense in terms of da'wah and bring along those who aren't on the path or who are a little bit far from the path. In terms of da'wah, what's a sadaqah is a smile. So it's not necessarily. And what do the ulama, the scholars, they say da'wat al-hal arjahu wa afsahu min da'wat al-lisan. So the state, that's why we talked about building the believer. The state of the believer, the condition of the believer, the nur, the enlightenment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the angels that follow the believer, they're stronger on the hearts of the non-believers in terms of bringing them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the words you say. Do you think that a lot of the people that are friends with you, who are non-Muslims, they're friends with you because you're good looking or you've got a lot of friends or you're smart or you've got a nice car or got a good phone or whatever? It's because of the nur that you've got inside of La ilaha illallah, and they're attracted to that because their heart can feel that, their soul can feel that. So da'wah isn't necessarily just what we say, but it's the state that we're in.
Barakallahu feekum, Shaykh. As I mentioned earlier, if we go back to the fundamental model of the human being in the Islamic tradition, why that's important is because it's a model of the human being, not the model of the Muslim. Every single human being has that component of ruh, nafs, and jism, which means that every human being, when the ruh is blown in and during conception in the womb, every human being comes into this world with a fitraic endowment, an endowment of latent possibilities that predispose people or predispose the human being towards the one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and towards the good. Every human being possesses this. Now, of course, at a certain age, usually at the age 2 or 3, with the acquisition of language, you go with development, the parents are able to then communicate with their children and indoctrinate them into the Christian form or Magian religion or whatever other religion. So at a certain crucial age, the fitrah becomes covered over, never really replaced. لا تبديل في خلق الله, right? But there can be a change in the sense of corruption of it, but never a completely a replacement of it. What that means is that essentially Islamic psychology is a psychology of the human being. It's not psychology for Muslims, first and foremost. It's a fitraic therapy, as I mentioned earlier. In that sense, and consistent with the Islamic idea or the idea in some Islamic traditions of al-isma al-adamiyya, the idea that every human being is intrinsically of such a unique dignity, human dignity, an inviolable dignity, as it were, with intrinsic rights, by virtue of being human, by virtue of having a ruh, before they're either this religion or that religion. That means that every single human being is capable of this kind of transformation, this kind of fitraic therapy. Now, is there a conscious attempt in the Islamic world or among those who are promoting Islamic psychology to develop this in this direction? Yes. Are the resources there yet? No. Enough people in the field? No. There's only maybe perhaps 3 or 4 centers globally that are consciously attempting to do this. And there's still a scholarly debate as to what the parameters are of Islamic psychology. Very quickly, for example, does Islamic psychology cover suluk or not? I'm of the opinion that it doesn't and it shouldn't. Then what does it deal with then? It deals with all sorts of other problems we discussed earlier on that horizontal plane of problems and developmental issues from birth to adulthood. When it comes to the vertical connection of suluk, the pathways are there already and available. Right? So we need more people like yourself and others, deeply rooted in this Islamic tradition, bil usul, as the Shaykh pointed out earlier, quite correctly. This process of tajdid al-mu'assal has to be rooted in the usul, but at the same time confident enough to draw on the classical Islamic paradigms in order to engage with contemporary perspectives. What I mean by classical Islamic paradigms, I don't just mean Quran and Hadith and fiqh. These are important, but these are the core. In the Islamic civilization, every single one of these disciplines poured into every other aspect of Islamic society and culture, in its therapy, in its hospital structures, in its practices, in its cuisine, in its art, in its architecture. So contemporary attempts to revive Islam have to not only engage with Quran, Hadith, fiqh, usul, aqidah, kalam, etc., but they also have to extend beyond and see how Muslims in previous generations conceptualize the very idea of what it means to be healthy in the body. What's the paradigm of medicine? What's the paradigm of geology? What's the paradigm of astronomy, etc.? Right? So we have to really expand. We commit an error today by saying, I'm going to go back to the Quran and then develop an Islamic psychology. How are you going to do that? By ignoring 1400 years of brilliant Muslim minds reflecting on the Quran and reflecting on their contemporary medical practices in order to build up 1,000-year-old models of the self that we can draw on. Very important. I hope that answered the question.
I got a text for Dr. Samir. Can you elaborate on how symbols of beauty, aesthetics in Islamic tradition, e.g. Arabic calligraphy, mosque architecture, impact ihsan?
In the Islamic tradition, of course, as we said earlier, the idea of al-husn wal-hasan, the idea of the good and the beautiful, are intimately interconnected. One being beauty of form, the other being beauty of character and behavior. They're intrinsically connected in the hadith of ihsan, and one of the deepest layers of spiritual excellence and perfection in the Islamic tradition. One point I do want to highlight, though, that I wanted to mention in the talk, but I didn't, was important for Muslims in order to confront the challenge of this notion of subjectivity of beauty, to revive a very important principle in the classical Islamic tradition, which is the objectivity of beauty. And what do I mean by that? I mean by that the classical tradition distinguished between two types of beauty, objective beauty and subjective beauty. Objective beauty being the kind of beauty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has deposited in creation, in the beauty of the natural cosmos and in nature. And if you want proof that objective beauty exists, just do a survey of every single human being on earth. You won't find a single person who finds nature ugly. Right? So beauty does exist and it is objective. However, there are subjective types of beauty that are contingent upon cultural preferences or individual subjective tastes, and that are also dependent on certain biographical circumstances. You might like red or green or blue or whatever it is, or you may hate green, even though green is intrinsically, from a fitraic perspective, a very positive color. So the problem with contemporary art and architecture is, contrary to thousands of years of human wisdom and human culture, rather than emulate the intrinsic beauty of objective beauty found in nature, which is what ancient cultures did, by emulating the perfection of God's beauty in creation, it decided to start following subjective whims and tastes. And that has to do with what we said earlier about decentering God from the cosmos and anchoring it in the fragile ego and its whimsical, subjective, internal life. Because once you center everything in that, with no objective beauty, no objective truth, no objective goodness, what happens? Are you a male or female? It depends on how I feel about it. It's no longer anchored in any truth, right? Is this beautiful or that beautiful? It's whatever I feel it is, right? So by decentering the human existence, by removing it from the objective standards that are intrinsic in the cosmos as manifestations of the divine names and ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by centering in that fragile ego, that fluff, that illusion, that batil, وَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ مِمَّنْ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ, that kind of hawa, we do art and architect based on what I want. So this building, why design it this way? I felt like putting this line in and this wall like this and this color like that, right? That's why, unfailingly, when you travel through traditional built environments or look at traditional art, 99% of them have a consistent, coherent sense of beauty, and they move the soul almost universally. The same can't be said for modern art and modern architecture. Right? And that's a fundamental reason. There's an inversion of values that I think we need to really reconsider. Sorry for the belaboring the point. Whoever asked that question, did someone ask the question in the audience?
It was
I forgot who asked it. In any case, I hope that suffices.
Shaykh Haisam, did you want to add anything?
I think that one thing that we really need to internalize and embody is be positive. Be positive. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is there. He's closer than your own jugular vein. That's the vein right here in your neck. Nothing is closer to you than that vein. He's closer. When you're 2, he's the 3rd. When you're 3, he's the 4th. When you're 4, he's in the Quran. I'm not making this stuff up. And we see all these trials and tribulations, and the boys especially, we're all gung-ho and dijad and the end of times, and we want to fight, and we want to, inshallah, if you're around, if you live your life in the right way, you'll be part of the people who are with the Mahdi. And if a person is a Muslim, and they profess La ilaha illallah, and they don't live their life in the right way, they'll see the Dajjal, say, that's the Dajjal, and they'll go dancing, skipping off with the Dajjal. It's in Hadith as well. So don't be overwhelmed by the negativity that you see about Islam. Don't be overwhelmed by the negativity you see, the pessimism, the world, there's no more, inflation and all the house prices, and you're never going to buy a house and blah, 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 blah. The best way to keep that under control, I know you've been told this and everyone says it and I say it and none of us follow it, is watch what you ingest, what you consume. And I mean by in terms of content. Watch what content you take in. It's so easy just to, they call it doom scrolling now or something, It's easy to doom scroll where you just don't even know where you're going. But that's not the believer. The believer doesn't do that. The believer is the most perfect person when it comes to time management. I'm completely atrocious. But the believer is the best believer is the one who's best in time management. And that's what will get us to our success. Because just at the end of times, there's trials and there's tribulations. At the end of time, the karamat come. They call them grace in some. In other words, like it's a mini miracle. It's not a real miracle. It's a mini miracle, and that'll come for those people, for us, when we're faced with a situation where there's no more asbab, there's no more you can eat, there's nothing to eat anymore, and so we'll say Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, wa la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar, and that'll be our nourishment. So, and Islam's going to come back. Don't worry. People are going to come in droves. They're going to come from the east, from Khurasan, but the black imamas. The Prophet told us the prophecies are there. The prophecies are there for those who hold tight, inshallah, to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So stay positive and stay strong.
We're just going to have 2 more questions from the audience because I'm a bit wary of time. There was a brother in the back and at the front. I'm just going to get them to, sorry guys, but inshallah next time we'll get your questions. But it was the brother in the back.
Sorry, this one's for Dr. Samir. Dr. Samir, so part of your talk you mentioned that the whole background of Western history as like the origin of this mental health crisis, like the whole break from God theory after the Enlightenment. But if we look at most of the rising mental health illness rates, basically, right? You see the spike in like the 90s. So prior to the 90s, it was kind of under control. So doesn't that sort of imply that the whole cause of this crisis we're seeing now isn't break from God thing? It's something more material.
Something more, sorry.
Material.
It's not breaking from.
It's not because we've broken from God. It's not because we've broken off from God, if that makes sense.
An extremely materialist lifestyle is one, by definition, that's broken away from God. In Maratib al-Wujud, in our classical understanding of Islam, there's multiple levels of reality. And if we reduce reality to just a material plane, well, then what happens then? We've collapsed levels and denied the existence of that which is beyond the material, which by definition is the realm of Ruhani and God. And so materialism is the flip side of, or the excessive materialism that we live today is the flip side of a denial of God. But it's not just materialism itself alone. Yani we mentioned the shift in the denial of truth as a result of the denial of God. No notion of absolute truth with a capital T can be sustained without the existence of a transcendental being. The same thing with an absolute morality. 250 years post Kant, Immanuel Kant, we haven't been able to establish morality on grounds other than, well, on purely rational grounds. Denial of beauty in aesthetics, also, that's the other realm in which it's also a direct consequence of rejecting God. I didn't establish the direct connections, and that requires a huge and very long lecture. But all these are consequences of untethering ourselves from that absolute center. And if they manifest by the 70s and 80s and 90s more so than before, it's because the consequences and ramifications of 19th century rejection of God are still being felt and will still unfold, and the slippery slope to nowhere is still unfolding. 30, 40 years ago, you wouldn't have heard people talking about gender issues in the way that they are today.
Yep.
It's a direct consequence of an unfolding process of redefining the self and redefining what constitutes human essence, right? And all the other story that we mentioned. So by anchoring the idea of what truth is and what I am supremely in the realm of the interiority of the subject, the human subject, which is a 19th century development, you're halfway towards this question of the human being defining everything, including who they are and what they are. By the time you get to Freud and the sexualization of the subjective or interior turn towards defining ourselves, tethering the idea of who or what you are to unconscious latent sexual desires, well, by the 60s and 70s, you get the issues we're facing today. I mean, there's a lot of books written on this, and you can easily trace the issue. But ultimately, if you want to go down to the root cause, the root cause of all this, it's the abyss that we've created. And I think one of the most brilliant writers who has diagnosed this, a very troubled writer, is Nietzsche. He says to the modern world, he says, you want to understand the direct consequences of what you've done? You've untethered the planets from the sun. What happens then? There will be bloodshed, rivers of blood. We had World War I and World War II. You'll destroy the earth. Now, without God, you have to define who you are and what you are on your own terms. Beyond good and evil, one of the titles of his text. No longer Christian morality or Islamic morality or religious morality. It's the will of power, and you decide and define what is the good and what is the bad. Right? So they're easily traceable. And our tradition is quite clear on this. And there are many Quranic verses. I gave you one Quranic verse about when the ego begins to reside as the ilah around which the self worships. The Quran is quite. The more I study the questions of contemporary culture and crisis where we're living in, the more I discovered the relevance of the Quran for our age. SubhanAllah, it's written with an intention. As Sayyid Abdul Rahman says, it's perfectly designed. Islam is perfectly designed to address the issues of humanity in the latter times that we live in.
And then the brother in the front, and then if we have time, I'll try get the sister here.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Mahmoud. My question is for Shaykh Haisam. And my question to you is, what would be one piece of advice to young Muslims that are in the diaspora communities in Australia that are being exposed to different cultures and ways of life, and how can they balance assimilation into society and still practice Islam correctly?
Jazakumullah khair. It's a good question. And in terms of Muslims melting into other societies or integrating into other societies, we have to give what's the best of us first. And the best thing we have is La ilaha illallah and the akhlaq of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have to be ready to give that up, to sacrifice that first, to let the world know and we have to have it first to be able to give it. But we have to let the world know, let those around us know, and really we're living Allah now. That's the reality. We're showing to Allah that Allah told us this is how you treat your neighbors, and that's what we're doing. We're actually following the prophetic tradition, and of course, proving to Allah what knows, but we're showing to Allah that Ya Allah we're following, and then the da'wah, it's all in the same sort of a category. But one thing that we add on top of it is the intention. And any deed can have multiple good intentions. It doesn't have to be just one intention. So it can have multiple good, even the hadith that we know, whoever makes hijrah for Allah and His Prophet. Too. Allah and His Prophet. So we can have multiple intentions in doing good deeds. And so we have to give that first. Secondarily, not everything in the culture that we come to is bad. Right? Like us Aussies, I mean, it's changed a bit since the brother mentioned the 90s, but back in those older days, Aussies were super humble. Now they're not, because the house used to be worth 40 grand. Now it's worth $1 million plus. Anywhere in Sydney is $1 million plus. So that's kind of changed. And what did Aussies celebrate in terms of personality and character? What they called the larrikin. I don't know if anyone's ever heard that word. It's old school Aussie. The larrikin was the person that spoke truth to power. And that's the person who was their hero. And who did they respect? The battler. Who knows what a battler is? Like, the person that struggles every single day. Yeah, that's gone out of the Aussie lexicon. So there's good aspects of the culture in which we come into. And for us, we're even luckier. We're even luckier because we deal with Muslims. We see different types of Muslims. Like if you go to the Turkish mosque and you go there late, the only people that come late to the Turkish mosque, with all due respect, are Arabs and people from the subcontinent. Turks, they're never late. That's how they are. They're regimented. They're on time. It's the same. Any Turkish mosque you go to in Australia, it's exactly the same. They read the same thing after prayer. The imam does the same thing. The people do the same thing. You better bring your socks, otherwise you're in trouble. So we can learn from the other cultures. And those things that we don't like or against, more specifically, they're against our deen, there's a prophetic formula for that. Change what you can when aminkum munkar. So if someone sees something that is detestable or is evil, if you like, don't just call it out. It's not good enough just calling it out or do a reaction in video. Oh, this is what's going on, I'm reacting to this person doing something evil. فَلْيُغَيِّرُوا. Change it with your hand. If not, with your tongue. If not, by making dua.
I really want to do one sister here because she's had a hand up the whole time. Is that okay? And then if we have time, I'll do you. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is for Dr. Samir. I'm very interested to know how the soul therapy impacts on depression, because I've been, I've accessed a lot of services in mental health and always gone through a very Western sort of framework, and very interested to know how an Islamic framework would be more helpful to me who struggles with PTSD and depression.
Is it possible to answer that question after because it's a bit elaborate?
Sure.
I don't want to take up too much time.
No
but suffice it to say that the classical Islamic tradition makes a very clear distinction between 6, 7, 8 different causes of depression. What's so remarkable and amazing about it is the extent to which it diagnoses things in a very accurate medical, empirical way. And only when bodily or psychosomatic reasons are ruled out does it begin to explore other possible reasons. So maybe we can get into a bit more detail after, inshallah, if it's quite long.
Exactly.
And then I'll get the sister here as our last question.
Jazakallah for both your talks are very inspirational. It really resonated with me, this idea of connecting with our indigenous population. And I was wondering, firstly, what practical ways can we do that, especially with the voice coming up? I know a lot of us are just starting to vote as well, so we can have a big say in that. Should we also start to have acknowledgements of country at Islamic events? What do you think about that?
but then also spiritually, like the indigenous kind of rhetoric, a lot of it has to do with things like truth telling, and they have like a really beautiful connection to the land. Like that spiritual connection lasts millenniums. How do we connect with that on a spiritual plane as well as practically in a political sense?
Inshallah, yeah, most certainly we should do the welcome to country. I normally do it before my classes. I was going to do it today, but it slipped my mind. But most certainly we should. I mean, that's as I said, it's High Court said it. That's the highest court in the land. There's no more Privy Council appealing to Britain. So most certainly, and most certainly, we should be involved with the communities. We should be their voice. You know, as Muslims, we have the distinct honor by Allah Subhanahu wa Taala that we have what's called a furqan, a criterion. We can determine what's truth and what's falsehood, and we need to speak out. It's difficult for Aboriginal people to speak out because they're disenfranchised in their own land, and they have been for 230 odd years. That they don't have a chance. And I didn't really understand it until that time when we went to Queensland and we went to see the Afghanis and the other Muslims there. We was praying across the road from the little town in the park, and we're having something to eat. And this Aboriginal guy walked into a hotel, black fella walked into a pub, and then he just got beaten to a pulp. And the police came, and then they arrested him. The guy that got beaten up by the other guys, and was all the just walked in, wanted a beer. They didn't want him to have a beer there, so they beat him up. And who did the police arrest? Black fella. So we have to take up their mantle. That as Australians and Muslim Australians, what do we say, Mozzies or whatever, Musis or whatever you want to say, right? That's our role. That's our role, to take up the mantle and not to tell them what to do either. That's not our role. Our role is to see, do they want self-determination? Well, in this world, they have a right to self-determination under the United Nations Charter. And we can support that. Of course, maybe I don't know if we know or we don't know. The reason why the established, I don't want to use racist terms, but just to get the point across, white government doesn't give any rights to the Aboriginal people, to the black people, because it's their land. They know they've done the wrong thing. They know that. If they start giving them rights, then they're afraid of, and who is it? It's the mining, basically mining and pastoralists. How did they get their land? How did they get their land? They worked hard for it? Is that what you're being told? Of the billionaires, when you watch them on social media, you work hard 17-hour days. Rubbish. They got grants because they were close to the royal family years ago. All these big families, all these big, very, very wealthy people you see on TV and in your social media feeds, that's how they got their land. And so they know that if, like the intervention, what was that about? And that was just the other day. Your lifetime's now 2004, but or 5. But what was that about? That was about a land grab. They wanted to mine, and they wanted to get more money for the mining interests and the corporations and the pastoralists. So they came up with this thing that these black fellas are always drunk, and what we should do is limit the way they can spend their money, and they move them off this particular part of land and move them off that part of land. Oh, all of a sudden there's a massive parcel of land that we can mine. How lucky that that's the case. That's what's going on. Like, that's the reality of what's going on. And if we don't speak to that, if we don't speak to that truth, and we've got a lot to do in this country, but that's the first truth. That's the first truth for this country. Before our, it's one of those, just like a poetic thing to say, but before our Islam, if each and every single one of us as believers, and we got that unique insight because we're a migrant community, if we don't say that stuff, if we just toe the party line, then what are we doing for this country? Because it's not good for anyone. We're not just trying to rescue the black fella. White fella's got to realise what he's done and what we've done as white people, because we're both. We're both. And if you look at us, we're more white fella than black fella than most of us, the vast majority of us. So where's our contribution based on what Allah's given us? And that's what we've got. And whatever it is, there's heaps of, there's Aboriginal people. I'll tell you one more story. I'll tell you one story that blew my mind with Aboriginal people. One time an auntie rang me up and she goes, "Oh, you're that Shaykh?" I'm like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Oh, I want you to represent us in the stolen wages case." And I'm like, I know maybe I shouldn't tell the rest of the story now, but anyway, what ended up happening was I said, you should go here and here and there. And she said that any time that Aboriginal lawyers get involved, they get corrupted. And any time the big time lawyers get involved, that they're also told that if you keep supporting Aboriginal rights, then we're not going to give you other work. I said, well, why do you want me? She goes, because I know the Muslims tell the truth. That's what she said. This is a long time ago, like 16, 17 years. I know, and any time that I meet with Aboriginal people, blackfellas, they love us. They love us because we got that heart. We got that soul. We got that spirit. We got La ilaha illallah, and they can feel it. 50,000 years continuous. Like, just think about it. Just think about it. 50,000 years they left as it was. Their footprint was just barely there. I mean, it was, but it was barely there. And they believe in a great spirit. What do we got? Allah. Al-Azim. Subhanahu wa ta'ala. They believe in the great spirit. So even when you look at some of their stories, they, in the dream time, that people were the size of Sayyidina Adam. In their stories, look them up. Go read them. They were the size of, even when they have the shapeshifters. We Muslims in the Sufi stories, there's some people that do shapeshifting. And when Ahmad Didat, rahimahullah, Shaykh Ahmad Didat came in 1996, I know that was a long time ago, he did some research, and he was saying that some of the Aboriginal tribes, the meaning of their names is Muslim. Some of them used to climb up trees and make it similar type of call like the Adhan. So, I know it's like kind of seems removed, but this is the time, if we want to do anything, if you want to get busy on your social media, the referendum's coming up. This is the time to talk about it. My personal view is, I'm not a political person, but it's not about politics. It's about right and wrong. How can they not be in the Constitution? How can they not? How can they not be? How can they just be, up until 1967, there was no such thing. They had no rights at all. There was fauna and flora, like animals and vegetation, and Aboriginal people didn't have no citizenship. They couldn't vote. They couldn't do anything. 1967, I know it seems like a long time ago, but myself and Hajj, that's within our lifetimes. That's just like the other day. So if you want to, like, as a Muslim, say something, do your research too. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to me. Get an idea. Do your research. There is so much of it out there. There is so much of it out there about what's happened to the Aboriginal. The best place to start, if you're really serious, read Maba. It's long, but you should read it and you're like, how can a High Court actually be admitting what happened? They actually admitted everything. It's just one of the best judgments I've ever read. Sorry, I'm very passionate about that issue. I've been saying this ever since I knew there was this thing called Maba. Ever since I started studying law in 96, that there's something going on, it's wrong. And it always has been wrong. And some people don't understand it, but we have the capacity to. So Allahu Alam if it's not on our shoulders more than anyone else's.
Thank you so much for that Q&A panel. Just as we conclude, I was just going to ask if you guys wanted to just have a final statement. Can we just keep it to 1 minute each, please?
I already had mine. I said be positive, said Dr. Samir.
Yeah, I mean, stay positive and just remember that Islam, in our practice of our deen and our Islam, from this kind of fitrahi perspective, we have to stop thinking about ourselves as just a minority with minority rights and our deen as somehow consisting of special minority rules and regulations, but rather if we truly understand our way of life as rooted in the fitrah, and that fitrah is somehow in every human being, then we potentially are able to, by being the natural Muslims that we are, to connect with every human being. And that's the best da'wah we can do, by being true to our fitrah and true to our deen. So let's ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us to this fitrah, inshallah, and to show us the path to haqq and the path to light, اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه، وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون، وسلام على المرسلين، والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم.